Before we dive into the questions, basically, I think a couple of things which I feel, जहाँ तक ADAS की बात है, I think we should talk about is, you should be able to simply define the two terms, like aggregate demand. You could define as the total demand for goods and services in the economy or total value of spending in goods and services in the economy, while aggregate supply is like the total production of goods and services in the economy, maybe in a given period of time if you want to add. जहां तक बात है aggregate demand की, we always want to talk about um, the four sectors or the components of aggregate demand, the CIGX minus M. Sometimes you are required to explain this. Like before 2023, तो आपको सारे components explain करने होते थे, but 2023 and onwards, I think we just have to name them. And if the question requires, like we're going to see a couple of them, so maybe like if they ask for like two reasons or three reasons, so which component is moving? So we want to pick, like for example, if we're talking about how consumption can change based on the question, if they want aggregate demand to rise, so maybe we might suggest like income tax reduction, right? And then you want to explain how income tax reduction leads to more disposable income, and so aggregate demand will rise. And if we're dealing with investment, maybe like interest rate reduction, we can talk about and how cost of borrowing falls, so businesses can borrow more and all. When we're dealing with government spending, please keep your discussion to government spending on final goods and services like public goods and merits and infrastructure. Avoid um, using subsidy or transfer payments like unemployment benefits and all. A lot of time kids end up writing ke, when they're explaining ke AD बढ़ सकता है because of government spending rise on subsidy and unemployment benefits. That's not part of G. You want to avoid doing that. You want to talk about how spending on infrastructure and public goods, merit goods, government expenses, those expenses जिसको हम आगे जाके when you do fiscal policy, in fiscal policy government spending के अंदर we talk about two kinds of spending. One is called capital spending and one is called current government spending. These both of these spending are they come under the exhaustive government spendings, but mainly they are spending on goods and services, right? So when we have like government ka capital spending, then we're talking about like government spending in making schools and hospitals and railway stations and all. फिर government की जो current spending होती है, it's running these public services, so administrative expenses and electricity expenses and equipment expenses and all. तो वो government spending में जाता है. And then X minus M obviously has to do with international trade, and you can talk about how maybe like depreciation can cause exports revenue to go up and import expenditure to fall down. So ये हमारा एक basic था उसके अंदर. Um, one of the questions which is still due, which I feel कि किसी भी point के ऊपर आ सकता है. Normally, when we or when they ask a question about aggregate demand and macroeconomic equilibrium and how inflation, economic growth gets affected using AD and AS diagram, in our diagram, we have to make sure that we write price level over here. This year and last year we got a lot of marks because macro के अंदर kids just write price on the y-axis. If you write price on the y-axis, that's a wrong label. It has to be. There is like zero tolerance for this. Price level goes on the y-axis, and you want to write real output or real income. Real output preferable. Real income भी चल सकता है. We know इसका abbreviation Y हम use करते हैं. But just writing P over here is not gonna cut it, right? Please make sure that you write price level. And then when we have our aggregate demand curve, it doesn't matter whether you make a downward sloping straight line or a curve, no problem whatsoever. और फिर जब हम aggregate supply बनाते हैं तो it's an upward sloping. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about over here is um, so far most of the questions that have come already, those are about aggregate demand shiftings. Okay, aggregate demand shifting to the right or shifting to the left. Okay, so like for example, if you're talking about aggregate demand shifting to the right, we know it's because of either C, I, G, or net exports increasing, right? So that's how you get an outward shift. Um, but we must also know at the same time that movement along the curve, like for example, for an 8 marker, a question 8 mark के अंदर जो first 3 marks होते हैं about knowledge and understanding, and they can ask you a question like, um, explain using a diagram why fall in price will cause aggregate demand to increase. A fall in the price. So because they're talking about a fall in the price level, they're not talking about a shift, but rather they're talking about a movement along the aggregate demand curve. Um, so, in order to explain, we have to talk about the three reasons as to why this happens. And we call it like if price level falls, right? So the three effects we had was one was called the wealth effect, one is called the interest rate effect, right? And the last one is called international effect. In some places, we even called it substitution effect, but Bamford is using international effect, so let's stick with his terminology. But ये हम बात कर रहे हैं इस movement के बारे में. We're not talking about CIGX minus M and all of this, basically the reasons for that, the shift reasons, but we're talking about the movement के reasons. Wealth effect is basically obviously talking about how when price level goes down, then people's purchasing power goes up, and so then they can afford more goods and services, both consumers and its investments, and right. And if price levels are going down, then the demand for money is also going down. And when demand for money goes down, interest rate falls. When interest rate falls, consumption increases, investment increases, and so on, right? तो उसका वो अपना एक इफेक्ट का लिंक होता है. So demand for money falls down, interest rate falls, consumers borrow and spend, investment businesses borrow and invest, and so on. And then you have international effect, which is about how when prices are falling, price of export goes down and exports revenue goes up and price of import because our product is more competitive. So import price relatively rises, not like in absolute number term rises, but relatively in comparison. So then price imports fall. तो ये आपका substitution effect होता है कैसे x minus m की value goes up and so AD goes up, right? So this is one of the things which is still due for a 3 mark. They can definitely ask you that. कभी तो आएगा ये. But mostly it's about shifts, aggregate demand curve shifting to the rights and all. Here, we also have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. When we bring them together, we talk about how we have an equilibrium, right? And this is called a macroeconomic equilibrium. It's very important because this particular equilibrium discusses our the macroeconomic aims, the three major macroeconomic aims, which over the next couple of weeks we're gonna develop on. तो जब हम इसकी बात करते हैं aggregate demand shifting to the right, it's also called demand pull inflation. When you do inflation, you come across this. But the key thing I want to focus here on is how y-axis and x-axis talks to us about um, our first macroeconomic objective, which is inflation. So if price levels are rising, then that's inflation. And if real output is rising, so we say economic growth is going up, actual economic growth is rising, and also we say employment is also rising. तो ये तीन मैक्रो इकोनॉमिक ऑब्जेक्टिव्स इस डायग्राम में नजर आते हैं and we make it very often. Other than this, obviously AD, right, left, aggregate supply shifts to the right and to the left, and how macroeconomic objectives gets affected. फिर उसके बाद we also keep a very close eye on the aggregate supply curves. It's especially the long run one from the two schools of thought. One is the new classical school of thought, and one is the Keynesian school of thought. The new classical school of thought says that your long run aggregate supply is vertical, which means that economy in the long run always reaches potential, whereas from the Keynesian's point of view, LRAS is sort of like this. Obviously, they have a historical reasoning for this, that economy can have long run equilibrium below full employment, and they can have it at full employment also. So, according to Keynesians, it's not necessary that your economy always reaches potential in the long run. It can continue to stay here for some time also. But according to the classicals, your economy will always be at potential if short run and long run meets there. Here, we have to be very mindful of this LRASC shifting to the right, meaning PPC shifting to the right. Basically, this is the supply side policy we're talking about. Supply side policy पे पूरा chapter है. Every single year, long run aggregate supply के ऊपर, sorry, every single year, fiscal, monetary, supply side, protectionist policies, protectionism जिसको हम कहते हैं, tariff quotas and all. इन चार पॉलिसीज में से कोई दो पॉलिसीज एवरी सिंगल ईयर आती है फॉर अ 12 मार्कर. तो these are important for policies, but the problem is you can learn what these policy does. But the key question usually comes ke they're gonna say ke how fiscal, monetary, yeah, how fiscal and supply side, or maybe just like how supply side can impact maybe just economic growth. Or sometimes they'll say macroeconomic aims, or maybe a blend of two, economic growth and prices. So when you're writing the answer, we want to make sure in our explanation we are direct, talking about um, the policy and the target of that policy, because यही चार policy सारे macroeconomic objectives में use होती हैं, right? So we need to be able to do them correctly. So one of the questions that I wanted to attempt today for this particular topic. तो एक जून 24 में आया है. Let me talk about that. So one question came in June 24. Um, Variant 21. So let's take a look at this. Very simple question. Straightforward. You know, let's take a look at how are we supposed to answer a question like this.
Three means any three.
Yeah, any three components, and each component is one mark, right? And you have to explain every the component that not just the component, but how that component is going to move. So any factor that can cause that. So if it says explain three of the components of aggregate demand and consider the extent to which they may increase without leading to inflation. So we know first thing is knowledge and understanding. We have about 4 marks, 3 marks for that. And then we have analysis for 3 marks, and then we have evaluation for 2 marks. That's how the breakup is. They're already saying that explain three components. So that means knowledge and understanding get 3 marks, so a lot way, man. So should we define aggregate demand की definition? I would always recommend you to do it. Please do it. Um, whether there is mark for it or not, इस question में तो बहुत clear है कि there is no mark for it, but we should always start like that. Make a habit with this terminology. The three components we have is obviously consumer spending. You have to choose between CIGX minus M, or it's about business investment. Uh, you have government spending, and we have net exports, right? These are the four components. You can choose any three of them, but you have to explain in order to get the entire mark. Um, so consumer spending के लिए, if you're doing, you would like to suggest कि if, like I was just telling in the beginning, that I personally like, आप एक का income tax कर लें. If income tax falls, because question is about, um, they're not even saying कि component का direction क्या होना चाहिए, but if you go further into the question, it is talking about consider the extent to which they may be increased without leading to inflation. So just to make it relevant to the question, I will make sure that I talk in terms of AD shifting to the right. I think we should be mindful of that. So this is what's happening. If income taxes decreases, then the disposable income increases, and as a result, consumer spending can increase. That's how C will rise. Don't use the same factor for explaining for the business investment also. Please change. I did not give marks if they explained with the same idea कि income tax कम होने से corporate taxes would fall, and maybe if they had written corporate taxes is falling क्योंकि वो फिर भी थोड़ा सा वो हो जाता है, पर्सनलाइज हो जाता है टू द बिजनेस इन्वेस्टमेंट. बट जस्ट सिंपली सेइंग कि डायरेक्ट टैक्सेस कम करने से कंज्यूमर स्पेंडिंग भी बढ़ जाएगी एंड बिजनेस स्पेंडिंग भी बढ़ जाएगी, आई वोंट गिव 2 marks फॉर इट. तो आई वुड प्रिफर स्टूडेंट्स यूजिंग टू डिफरेंट रीजंस for two different component changes. So if interest rate falls down, cost of borrowing goes down, um, borrowing from business community can increase, and that could lead investment to rise. Government spending के अंदर तो simply you can just suggest that government's expenditure on infrastructure rises or something, right? Government expenditure on, I gave mark for it. कोई मसला नहीं था इसमें. As long as they gave an example. other than subsidy. Subsidy would have been something which would have confused me whether I should give mark or not. वैसे तो I did not, right? And public goods and um, net exports के अंदर, if you want to suggest, I think depreciation is a good one to explain. If your currency depreciates, the price of export falls down, and as a result, export revenue goes up. I will specifically write exports revenue going up. I might have mentioned this before also in circular flow, that please just simply avoid saying exports will rise. All right. If you want to say, if you, because it makes us confused कि आप export volume rise बोल रहे हो या export revenue rise कह रहे हो, क्योंकि CIG X minus M के अंदर export revenue होता है. So we want to make sure that you write exports revenue. And because of depreciation, import prices actually becomes expensive, not relatively, but actually becomes expensive. So as a result, import expenditure falls, and as a result, X minus M के अंदर increase आ जाएगा. So you can choose any of the three, and that's good enough. You cannot just simply list down the components and just say कि C बढ़ जाने से या I बढ़ जाने से हो जाएगा. You have to explain how those components can move. All right. फिर उसके बाद, for analysis, consider the extent to which um, they may be an increased, they may be increased without leading to inflation. They haven't asked for a diagram. I don't think there would be a mark for a diagram also. But if students can use the diagram to further explain their point of view, because sometimes, like I've mentioned before also, that sometimes kids explain better with the diagram, and they end up writing the right thing, while they're explaining the diagram, and it makes perfect sense to the examiner also. So I'll explain it with the diagram, and then write up can be taken independently also. So over here, if you look at the question one more time, the question is sort of begging a discussion that when AD shifts to the right, maybe inflation may happen, maybe it may not, right? So we want to write that how inflation may happen and how it may not happen, right? Like, in fact, it should be all about, like, if I look at it, it increased without leading to inflation के ऊपर हो रहा है ना, to what extent it can be. Okay, so this is what I'm thinking. Graphically, there are two things. I'll make two diagrams to explain two point of views of mine here. Okay. One is, I'll make a regular aggregate supply upward shifting right this. Okay. SRAS and aggregate demand. Even if you write like aggregate supply, it's perfectly fine. कोई मसला नहीं है. But this other one, okay, this other one is definitely, like, if I make my LRAS curve something like this, okay, whether inflation will happen, whether economic growth will always increase, whether employment will always increase. Basically, you want to talk about this LRAS ka curve, from the Keynesian view. This helps a lot. So yeah, so without inflation happening, right? So y-axis के ऊपर हमारे पास inflation होता है. So this is what I'll explain. Okay. One is a situation where if AD increases, yeah, we know if AD increases, inflation will happen. We can clearly see if AD increases, inflation will happen. But the question we have to answer is to what extent AD can increase without creating inflation. So if I say if AD increases, but at the same time aggregate supply increases by, let's say, same or maybe more, right? दोनों तरीके से हो सकता है. So मेरे write up के अंदर I'll definitely mention that if aggregate demand increases, that aggregate supply increases by more than aggregate demand, then inflation will not happen. So that's my first analysis ka discussion, that if AD increases, then price levels will rise unless aggregate supply also increases by same or more than aggregate demand. I was just thinking कि मुझे इसको थोड़ा सा और expand करना चाहिए. I should mention that if AD का increase is equals to AS ka increase, so then no inflation, right? Like my diagram is showing. But if AD ka increase is less than aggregate supply ka increase, so you can actually have fall in inflation or deflation can actually occur. So that could be one of my discussion. Another discussion that I want to do is about this part, when I'm drawing this diagram. And I would like to suggest in this is our full employment levels, right? So let me write FE, full employment level. So I am suggesting that if economy is operating, if economy is, yeah, so if economy is operating below YFE, which is capacity, then increase in aggregate demand will not cause inflation. How? Let me show it in my diagram. If AD increases and we're at below capacity, we can clearly see that prices are still at the same level. No change in price whatsoever. Price is still at the same level as it was earlier. However, if we are at full capacity, then any increase in aggregate demand will also cause uh, prices to rise. So we're talking about this portion, and you can explain that also. So that's what this evaluation, sorry, not evaluation, the analysis will be about. फिर evaluation के अंदर they're saying consider the extent to which they may be increased without leading to inflation. So what can we write in evaluation for this? Because pretty much we have answered most of the stuff. I think हमने analysis के अंदर we've already talked about that. Yes, inflation can happen, inflation may not happen. We've spoken about AD ka shift along with AS ka shift. In my evaluative statement, I'm just simply thinking an increase in aggregate demand. I think repetition ही हो जाएगा if I go about and say that it depends. Maybe I would like to talk about like um, maybe like in developing nations which are below operating below capacity. Again, वही बात ही हो जाएगी analysis वाली. So I feel there might be a repetition over here that if economy is below capacity, or maybe even like um, can we talk about open closed economy or something like that? Maybe short run, long run ka discussion. Yeah, I think that would be a good one. Aggregate demand increases through monetary and fiscal policy, जो कि हमने भी ऊपर जो options लिखे हैं, indirect taxes and sorry, direct taxes and interest rate. These are fiscal and monetary policies, right? So demand will shift in the short run. Um, Supply catches up in the long run. So maybe in my evaluation, I would have a discussion of that because the question is about to what extent AD can increase without leading to inflation. So I can suggest that in short run, when aggregate demand increases, then price levels may increase because long run के अंदर aggregate supply can increase and catch up with the aggregate demand and maybe bring down the price levels again. So maybe in the short run, prices may actually go up because there is a lag in the supply curve in changing. I think that is one thing though my evaluation can that I can definitely discuss from that point of view. Okay. Any questions on this?
No.
All right, excellent. Another question relating to this. I think this one's a good question. It came in January 24, paper 23. Let's take a look at this one. Um, Very similar, but still like asked in a slightly एक नया element. I haven't seen this element as such before. इस तरह से question के अंदर. Okay. So in this question also, अगर आप देखें तो काफी similarity है, but obviously they're asking for a diagram. So diagram becomes a must thing that we wanna write about. They're saying with the help of a diagram, explain how an increase in aggregate demand affects the level of real output and the price level in an economy and consider when such increase may become a problem. I'm again thinking the same LRAS, which we just did in the previous one. But first, what we want to do is for an 8 marker, we want to make sure that we get all our marks, whichever we can. Diagram मांगा है and सिर्फ diagram में aggregate demand का discussion है, but I feel based on the later part of the question where they're saying real output पे impact and price level पे impact, so that can't be done just by AD. So I guess we should make AD and AS both. I have seen students do this also. They write demand over here and then they make a key over here that D equals to aggregate demand. I don't know why they go through that process. Just simply write aggregate demand over here. Um, Avoid that confusion sort of a thing that they do sometimes. So this is where our equilibrium stands. ये तो हमारा हो गया diagram. अभी इसमें हमने aggregate demand का increase नहीं दिखाया है. But if you were to show, this is how we would show aggregate demand curve shifting to the right. Um, Price level goes here, equilibrium is here. Couple of things that we would want to talk about is, at least from the diagram's point of view, um, I think we have everything marked. थोड़ा सा, if you want equilibriums की marking कर लो, arrows बना लें. There's not much that we can do in this. बहुत ही ज्यादा कुछ अगर extra labels ही डालने हैं, तो this is what we can also do. C plus I plus G plus X minus M का combination gives you an AD. I think from the diagram's point of view, probably like एक आध mark ही होगा diagram का. But in fact, there are 2 marks for the diagram. 1 mark is obviously for the labels, and 1 mark is for the shifting. It's surprising that there's no another mark for even marking the equilibriums, that how price levels are rising and real output is increasing. But they're saying with the help of a diagram, explain how an increase in aggregate demand affects the level of real output and prices and all. Okay. Like I've mentioned before also, I personally would always suggest कि please aggregate demand की definition जरूर दिया करो. You never know when they might decide कि there can be a mark for it. When we explain aggregate demand, we say aggregate demand is the total spending of goods and services in the economy coming from maybe like formula लिख लो, AD is equals to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Take something like this. Um, Back in the day, before 2023, तो हम देखते थे कि essays के अंदर ना, they would want a little paragraph on AD की definition, AD के components mentioned, and very briefly what C represents, what I represents, what G represents, and X minus M represents also. Okay, what I see over here, let me just see the marking scheme for a second. In the marking scheme, what they've done is an understanding of the components of AD, that is CIGX minus M. Now, they're saying understanding of the components. So that basically simply means that students' ability to uh, just show that a student real understands that aggregate demand में ये components आते हैं. Does that mean we have to like further explain? I don't think so. इतना ज्यादा डिटेल के लिए 1 mark हो नहीं सकता है. So my recommendation to you would always be कि AD के definition दो, उसके components का formula दे दो, and maybe just mention what CIGX minus M just simply represents. No further discussion on what can give it shifts or not. बल्कि इनफैक्ट वो तो आगे जाके हो ही जाना चाहिए, बिकॉज क्वेश्चन के अंदर लिखा है एक्सप्लेन हाउ इंक्रीज इन एग्रीगेट डिमांड. तो इंक्रीज इन एग्रीगेट डिमांड का मुझे कुछ तो रीजन तो देना ही पड़ेगा, इन माय ओपिनियन. ओके, तो उसके बाद, now that we have this, we might want to suggest like maybe just one reason that if income taxes falls, disposable income rises, and that leads to higher consumption and higher investments, which may shift the aggregate demand to the right. And as a result, when it shifts to the right, as our diagram is also showing, that the price levels will rise, right? The result is price levels will rise, and real output का भी पूछा है, तो real output will also rise. अगर employment बोला होता, तो employment would also rise as well. I think that is something that we can do. Because it says, and consider when such an increase may become a problem. I think at this point, what we should also do is AD का increase in the analysis only, we need to have a discussion on whether it will be problematic or not. तो उसके लिए जो अभी हमने इन वन लास्ट उसमें जो हमने एक डायग्राम भी किया था, this one right here, I think we would want to bring this one in our discussion dubara. So if I copy it and bring it to this one here, and maybe a slight explanation. You don't need to draw this particular diagram, okay? But इसकी आप explanation जरूर use कर सकते हो, like in the sense that if AD increases, when economy is operating below capacity, then price level does not rise and real output rises significantly, you know, so then it's not a problem, right? It's no problem then in that case. However, अगर economy full capacity के ऊपर है, if you are at full capacity and if AD increases, then what happens? Well, price level goes up and your output does not change. Output remains where it is. So it's a bad trade-off, basically, right? So from the macroeconomic point of view, that is sort of bad. Um, until unless aggregate supply increases, we would suggest that it will continue to be a problem. Um, let me see what the marking scheme is suggesting for analysis. So they're suggesting that for an explanation of why AD increases, okay, so you can suggest one reason AD का right पे shift क्यों आया and make a habit of that. Okay, AD right or left and one just throw one or two liner as to why that would happen. And then for an explanation of why this increase may not cause problems such as inflation because of the shape of the aggregate supply, because AS may increase in line with aggregate demand if increase is due to increase in investment. Okay. So they're pretty much taking वही पिछले ऐसे वाली ही सारी बातें. ये जो हमने डायग्राम बनाया है, I think that's the later part. Yeah, for an explanation of why it may cause problem, example, the economy is at full capacity and AS cannot rise, so then inflation will be a problem. But the second one is that if AD increases, and with this, अगर आपका aggregate supply भी increase हो जाता है, especially if you have done investment, your component increases investment, so aggregate supply will also shift to the right and prices will come back down. So then in that case, it's not a problem because real output is going up and prices remains the same. So not a bad idea, right? The problem, let me tell you the problem. The problem is when you do that whole LRAS, full employment, below employment, that entire explanation is just one mark. ठीक है? और AD increase होता है और AS अगर catch up कर लेता है, that also is considered as just one mark. If you write one of these two, maximum you can get is one, no matter how lengthy your explanation is. You understand? That's why AS ka grade and threshold is really low because you have to, whatever you've written, it just should be included in the marking scheme. One might say कि अगर आप ये वाले पॉइंट को ग्राफ के साथ अच्छे से एक्सप्लेन करते हो and you talk about the below employment and at full employment one should get 2 marks for the explanation, you will not get 2 marks for the explanation. ठीक है. So you want to अब ADAS के अंदर in two questions we've seen there is a consistency that when they're asking कि whether something will happen, whether prices will always rise, there are two things we want to discuss. One is about the resource usage, and one is about if aggregate supply catches up. ठीक है. फिर उसके बाद in the evaluation, um, recognition that increase in AD may result in an inflationary increase in the price beyond the full employment level of output. In fact, वो जो हमने पूरी इस पॉइंट की डिस्कशन किया था वो आपका इवैल्यूएशन में काउंट हो जाएगा. I think again इसके अंदर you can do the short run, long run की discussion also, that if AD increases in the short run, it may cause inflation. But in the long run, if AS catches up, then inflation might not happen. तो वो वाला again इसमें अभी भी valid है वो वाला evaluation. So you can still get mark, but in your answer writing, and finally you can write a small conclusion in the end that such an increase may be a problem um, if it is creating a larger impact on the inflation and a smaller impact on economic growth. But if economic growth is rising by in comparison to the inflation, then it may not be considered a problem. So since question ये है, तो एक last evaluative line, evaluation के बाद एक conclusion की line should finalize that particular thing. ठीक? So that's how you can basically answer. So there's a lot of repetition that happens इसके अंदर. I remember checking, एक नवंबर में क्वेश्चन आया था and I found उस क्वेश्चन के अंदर I'll tell what mistakes a lot of kids ended up doing. Um, it was नवंबर का पेपर. All right, let me just open that paper for a second. It was November ka question. It was our variant. Um, okay. All right. Let's take a look at this one. So this one, though, I checked, so that's why I remember clearly what the examiner told us to be mindful of. Right. So this was November 23, paper 22, question number 5A. It says, with the help of a diagram, explain one reason for an increase in aggregate demand and one reason for an increase in aggregate supply. You get basically 1 mark for making the two diagrams and showing how aggregate demand ka increase and aggregate supply ka increase. And one reason aggregate demand to increase hoga, you had to be a little bit more, explanation was required. थोड़ा ज्यादा डिटेल के अंदर. So, let me just. Yeah. And consider whether an increase in aggregate demand will always lead to inflation, right? So same, वही November 23 के अंदर the question has all the same things that the previous one had. Always start your answer by defining the terms, whether they give you mark for it or not. From my point of view, इसकी इसका डायग्राम बेसिक नॉट द डायग्राम बट इसकी ग्रेडिंग कैसे होनी चाहिए based on the two questions we've done already, by the way. ठीक है, so we would suspect कि इसकी होनी चाहिए that because they're saying कि diagrams with brackets, so you can actually make two diagrams. Okay. Labels we want to be mindful of. Unnecessary mark we don't want to give because every single mark is important. So we want to show मैं तो एक्चुअली एडीएस दोनों का ही बनाऊंगा बिकॉज नीचे का जो लेटर पार्ट ऑफ द क्वेश्चन है ना इंक्रीज इन एग्रीगेट डिमांड विल ऑलवेज लीड टू इन्फ्लेशन सो इट्स sort of like answers both if I do this. So this is what I'll do. With the help of a diagram or diagrams, explain one reason for an increase in AD. I'll show AD ka shift to the right, and then I will show another diagram where I would do aggregate supply ka increase to the right, and I will make sure that मैं अपने equilibriums को जरूर mark करूं. These are the two things that I would draw, assuming के एक mark होगा for the diagram, and then I would assume के एक mark होगा for explaining how one of the components of aggregate demand के अंदर C होता है, I होता है, G होता है, X minus M. I would think कि इसका AD की definition नहीं होगी, but I think we should still define it. So I'll stay consistent with my idea that we should always define the terminologies. Then we can give the formula and we can suggest one reason that consumption will rise if income taxes can fall, if income taxes fall. Income tax क्यों गिरेगा? Disposable income बढ़ेगा and consumers will buy. Aggregate supply may increase because of maybe like some sort of cost of production reduction, maybe something like if indirect taxes falls down, or maybe if income taxes falls down, तो wages जो है वो कम हो जाएंगी, तो cost of production गिर जाएगी. Maybe like a cost of production related reason that how cost of production fall can actually increase aggregate supply, or maybe like labor productivity increasing may cause that to happen. So I think all of this I would do hoping कि मुझे मेरे 3 मार्क तो पूरे मिल जाने चाहिए. What is the marking scheme saying? Marking scheme is saying, okay, give 1 mark to the students if they define aggregate demand. You see? या फिर if the student has written that aggregate demand जो है वो CIG X minus M से होता है. I think formula would have sufficed. 1 मार्क आपको पूरा मिल जाता है even if you had written the formula or the definition. ठीक है? Definition में let's be mindful. Total demand या total value of spending in economies, goods and services at a given price level, right? तो ये इसको मत भूला करो. That needs to be done also. They're giving mark for aggregate supply की definition के ऊपर. Total output producers are willing and able to supply at a given price level. And then 1 mark for the diagram as we suspected. In fact, हमको तो bonus mark मिल गया इधर. Because analysis के अंदर they're talking about AD के increase का एक reason, supply के increase का एक reason, and show these increase by rightward shifts in both curves and the resultant impact on the price level of an accurate diagram. Now, this is where I have problem with this. They're saying एक ही diagram के ऊपर and the resulting impacts on the price level of an. I think you can do separate diagrams. It sounds like it has to be done on the same diagram, but actually you can do two separate diagrams. Now I'm forgetting कि हमने क्या किया था इसके अंदर. Um, rightward shift हो रहा है दोनों डायग्राम के अंदर and the resultant impacts लिखा है, that means two separate diagrams would have been fine on the price level of an accurate diagram. Yeah, but one thing is for sure that सिर्फ AD या सिर्फ AS का diagram would not have done it. So it had to be an equilibrium ka diagram. So one lesson we need to learn over here is simply individual demand curve and shifting se better hai, might as well just put in the supply curve also and show the resulting effect of it. जो फिर ये लोग जो इवैल्यूएशन में ले रहे हैं, आई वुड नॉट हैव डन दिस. व्हाट आई वुड हैव थॉट इज ये इस तरीके से मार्क मिलना चाहिए था. एक mark for the diagrams, एक maybe for this and एक maybe for that. That should have been knowledge and understanding. And then in our analysis, because they're saying here, consider whether an increase in aggregate demand will always lead to inflation. So what we were doing in our previous essays, I would have actually talked about those two things, maybe a diagram shifting AD curve to the right and showing how AD के increase होने से price levels would go up as the diagram is showing. But I would have done a counter argue that if AD increases and aggregate supply also increases, then maybe price would have no change, right? And it depends on the whether we are operating under capacity. So if you're operating under capacity, then prices में कोई change नहीं आता. But if you were at full capacity, then prices should have actually risen, ना? So उसके अंदर prices would have risen, लेकिन under capacity में prices would not have risen. That is something I would have thought के analysis में वो जाना चाहिए था, based on the more recent questions that we've attempted. And then in your evaluation, let me go back to the question one more time. Consider whether an increase in aggregate demand will always lead to an inflation. So I think based on this question, I think वो बात भी ठीक है. I would have done the short run, long run wala discussion all over again with the evaluation. So three different questions, three different way of marking. Almost this one, शुरू वाले के अंदर there was a different way of marking. बाकी 24 में तो consistency नजर आई है हमको. Minute differences in the question, but the key operations remain the same in the question. So lesson to learn, diagrams पूरे complete होने चाहिए. And you must talk both sides of the argument and give definitions. You never know कब वो definitions count में आ जाती हैं. And this is how sometimes kids who are, जो बिल्कुल ही बेसिक्स करके जाते हैं और बेसिक्स डेफिनेशन लिख लेते हैं, they end up getting the mark. And kids जो बहुत extensively पढ़ के जाते हैं, they don't get the marks. Why? Because they did not do the basic definitions and stuff, and they did the complicated stuff. So they lost simple marks, you know. इसमें, please, I've mentioned this before also, assistant examiners don't have their own justification for marks. जो marking scheme में जहां जहां जिन points के ऊपर marks लिखे हुए हैं, especially in 8 mark का, those points needs to be there. Okay? So we just want to make sure that we put in the relevant information.